Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about the neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville, the president's comments about it, and the moral equivalence some people, including the president, are drawing between the supposed Antifa people and the white nationalist KKK and neo-Nazis at the rally. To begin, it's simply amazing that we live in an age where we have neo-Nazis marching through the streets. We have neo-Nazis and KKK members proudly marching through the streets with their identities known. They're not wearing hoods, they're not wearing masks. They're open about this. And obviously, they should have the right to protest. They have the same rights as anybody else. They have the right to freedom of speech. They have the right to hold the views that they hold, as terrible as they may be. And it's astounding that this is happening today. So something is wrong here. Something has gone awry. There are people in this country who don't believe in American values on both sides. And we're going to be talking about that in just a minute. But something is very wrong here, and we need to have a conversation about that. And let's start with the president's comments. The president has been very wishy-washy on this whole thing. First, he condemned violence on many sides. Then he condemned racism and hate in a second press conference a couple of days later. Then he came in and said that there were good people and bad people on both sides. And this has sort of led to people making a moral equivalence between the Antifa people and the Nazis. Now, obviously, both of them are bad. I do think that both of them should be called out. You know, as terrible as the Nazis are, and their ideology is absolutely horrible, as terrible as they are, that doesn't mean that you should have the right to beat them up, to assault them, to punch them. And Antifa doesn't just do that. They don't just, beat up Nazis. They go after fairly mainstream conservatives, too. They go after people like Ben Shapiro. They go after Charles Murray. They go after a bunch of people who aren't Nazis, who aren't, racists necessarily, who are just people with right-leaning opinions, people who think that the government should largely be out of people's lives, people who think that lower taxes will generate more prosperity. I mean, these people aren't Nazis. So they do go after fairly innocent people who don't hold Nazi views, who aren't being violent. And they go after, they try to shut down their events, and they attack people for being conservative. But they do also go after actual Nazis like this as well. And if they just went after the actual Nazis, I still wouldn't support it. I still wouldn't support these people, but I also wouldn't really care. I really could not lose any sleep over Richard Spencer getting punched in the face. But that doesn't mean that it's good for our society, that people are getting hit in the face because they're Nazis. Not only is political violence wrong, but it also is ineffective. By hitting these people in the face, what are you doing? Are you going to change their minds? Are you going to convince somebody who's neutral, who's on the fence, which I don't know how you could possibly be on the fence on Nazism, but whatever. But if you're on the fence, do you think that you're going to see someone getting punched in the face like, oh, you know what? You proved me wrong. You know what? Maybe those ideas are bad after all. No, it doesn't actually do anything. It just emboldens them and encourages violence back at you, which we saw. We saw them drive a car through the crowd of protesters who, as far as I could tell, were peaceful and kill somebody. So it's not an effective tactic. It's not morally just. There's no reason for it. So yes, Antifa needs to be dealt with as well. Antifa, there needs to be a conversation about that. The police need to crack down on violence on both sides. I agree. But on top of that, you also need to call out the hatred and bigotry associated with their ideology. You can't just call out the violence. You have to call out the hate associated with the Nazi ideology, with the racist ideology, with the white nationalist ideology. And these people are looking up to Trump, and they've gone down a very dark path. They've gone down a very, very dark path, and they look up to the president. So if somebody like me says, hey, your ideas are terrible, you should really self-reflect and try to think about the type of person you want to be and what you want to do with your life. If I say something like that, they're not going to listen. If CNN says something like that, they're not going to listen. If Bernie Sanders or even Paul Ryan says something like that, they're not going to listen. But these people, David Duke, the leader of the KKK, obviously not somebody who could probably be convinced whatsoever, but his followers might be. He says he's carrying out Trump's agenda. They're carrying out Trump's agenda in Charlottesville. So the president needs to be firm. He needs to let these people know that they're going about this the wrong way. Maybe they're angry. They're angry because they lost their job and they see that the CEO of the company is black. They're angry because they see these social justice warriors being racist. And so they think, well, I'm going to become a racist too. That's not a very logical position. Becoming racist because somebody else is racist is not logical. It's not rational. But a lot of people in this country aren't very smart. A lot of people in this country aren't very intelligent. They don't really think things through. And so you see people becoming radicalized. And these people are looking up to Trump. They look up to him as a role model. There's someone who they respect, who they voted for. So the president has an opportunity to say, no, this is not the way forward. This is not the right path. He has the opportunity to tell them that, maybe you're angry because you lost your job to a Mexican immigrant, or maybe you're angry because you see the social justice warriors being mean to white people. You see them saying you can't be racist against whites. You see them saying all this stuff. But the answer to that is not to become a racist yourself. The answer to that is not to embrace extremism. You can't fight racism with more racism. It doesn't work like that. And a lot of these people might not listen. A lot of these people, Richard Spencer, I don't think his mind's going to be changed. Baked Alaska, his mind's not going to be changed. These people are deeply set on hate, and they're making money off of it. They're making tons and tons of money, and they're doing it for the popularity and for the fame. So yeah, those people, you're not going to be able to change their mind. But their followers, they look up to you, Mr. President. They look up to you. So you have the opportunity to set them on the right path, to bring them back into society, to bring them back into the mainstream, where they won't be doing Nazi rallies with fucking tiki torches and running people over with cars. You have the opportunity to let these people know that, hey, I know you don't like the SJWs. I know you don't like Antifa. Neither do I. But the answer is not to become just like them, but from the other side. The answer is not to embrace racism. It's not to embrace violence. And if you could convince even one person to drop their terrible views, that would be a step forward. And, I don't really think that we should be in a society where people follow the leader, where just because Trump says something, that means everybody should do it. Just because Bernie Sanders says something, that means everybody should do it. No. I don't believe we should be in a society like that. But that is how our society works. That is how people are. They're very partisan. And they look up to very specific people and want those people to solve all of their problems. And they think that they're heroes, that they're the greatest people on earth. That's not how our politics should be. But as long as our politics are like that, then those leaders should try to set a good example. Those leaders should try to be a positive role model. But when you try to muddy the waters, when you're reluctant to condemn these people, when you're reluctant to tell them that they're wrong, and when you're reluctant to try and set them on the right path, or at least separate yourself from them, they think that you're on their side. They think that their ideas are right. When you say that there are good people on both sides, you're giving them some room to say, oh, the president doesn't really condemn us. He doesn't condemn our ideas. He doesn't condemn our violence. He's one of us. He's just trying to play PR. And you see people like David Duke and Richard Spencer applauding the president's remarks. A condemnation of their groups should not be met with applause from them. As for there being good people on both sides, I'm sure there were plenty of good counter-protesters. People who weren't Antifa people or engaged in violence, who wanted to protest the racism. But good people on the Nazi side, this was an event organized by Richard Spencer, Baked Alaska, Jared Taylor, David Duke, the former leader of the KKK. These were the people organizing this event. There were no good people in the crowd as far as I could tell. And if you are a non-racist person and you find yourself in a crowd completely surrounded by people carrying Nazi flags and white supremacist flags and KKK banners, then you'd want to get the hell out. No rational person thinks, well, I don't agree with the Nazis standing right next to me shouting death to Jews and Jews will not replace us, but I'll still stay out and hang out with them, or maybe we'll grab a beer later on, it'll be great. No, you don't do that. You get the hell out of there. No reasonable person is going to stay in that crowd. Stay surrounded by these neo-Nazis. And I was talking to a friend of mine earlier today about this, and he suggested that some of these people might be misguided, that they've adopted this white nationalist, neo-Nazi, KKK persona because they're angry at Black Lives Matter and the social justice warriors, and they think, hey, if these people can be racist, why can't I be racist too? And maybe there are people like that. Maybe there are people who think, well, if these people are racist, might as well become racist too. The only way to fight racism is more racism. But there might be people who think that way. But if you want to change those people's minds, you can't just say, well, they're good people. They were just brainwashed with this ideology. You don't say that. They're not going to change their views unless they're confronted. Unless they realize, I'm going down the wrong path. I'm doing the wrong thing. This bigotry isn't the way forward. This white nationalism isn't the way forward. You're not going to convince them by saying, oh, well, they're good people like President Trump did. No, you're not going to be able to do that. That's not how you're going to be able to convince them. You've got to have a frank conversation with them and convince them that they're wrong. And people like me probably aren't going to be able to do that because they're not going to listen to us. They're going to say that I'm a SJW cuck who doesn't support the president. But if somebody like Trump goes out there and says it, then they're going to be willing to listen. So that's why it's important for President Trump to go out there and condemn these people wholeheartedly. Don't beat around the bush. Don't be hesitant. Just come out and say it like it is. And I also want to touch upon something that I saw on Kotaku in action. Kotaku in action was calling out Sam Harris, one of the big advocates against social justice warriors and this extremely illiberal ideology we're seeing take hold of the left. Somebody who's a very reasonable and fairly moderate guy. He said that out of all the identity politics, white identity politics is surely the worst. And he got attacked by Kotaku in action because he didn't say that both sides were equally bad, because he thinks that white nationalists are worse than feminism. And he's right. Say what you will about feminism or Black Lives Matter. I've got a lot of disagreements with those movements. But I think that most of the people who support feminism, most of the people who support BLM probably, are actually good people who believe in equality. I don't really agree with them. I don't really agree with their tactics. I don't really agree with some of the extremist stuff. And I think that some of their leaders are pretty cancerous people. But most of them probably believe in equality. You can't say the same about white supremacists or white nationalists. There is no good neo-Nazi. There is no good white supremacist. These ideologies are inherently hateful. These ideologies are inherently evil. So I don't think there is an equivalence there. Feminists, you might not like them. You might not agree with them. Some of them are bigots, but a lot of them aren't. But when it comes to someone like David Duke or Richard Spencer, you can't say, well, it's just the same as feminism, just as bad as feminism. No. They're just as bad as maybe the extreme BLM people, or just as bad as perhaps the extreme feminists who hate men. But they're not the same as feminists in general. And there's also a case to be made that groups like minorities and women have been underprivileged in the past. And you could debate whether or not you think they are today. But obviously women had to fight for the right to vote. Black people had to fight to end segregation and Jim Crow laws. So they had a lot of legitimate grievances. What legitimate grievance does a white supremacist have? Some kid on Tumblr says he hates all men, or he hates all white people. Okay. That's bad. Sure, I agree that's bad. But what policies are being implemented that will discriminate against whites? I mean, you could maybe say, I guess, affirmative action. That discriminates against Asians more than it discriminates whites, though. And a lot of people already oppose affirmative action. A lot of conservatives oppose it. A lot of liberals oppose it. A lot of libertarians oppose it. So you don't need to become a neo-Nazi to oppose affirmative action. And there really aren't any white issues. White people aren't being killed by police officers in higher numbers or because of their skin color. White people aren't being discriminated against by the government or our society in any way. I mean, the social justice warriors, when was the last time you actually saw one in the real world? I've actually had a couple of run-ins with them. I've had a couple of run-ins with them because I took a women's studies class because I wanted to understand their ideology better. And I ended up disagreeing, of course, with a lot that was said in the class. And there were a couple people in the class who thought that video games cause real-world violence and stuff like that. So there were a couple of people who hold some pretty bizarre views and I guess would be classified as social justice warriors. But that's pretty much it. Never in my workplace have I encountered somebody who's a social justice warrior. And that's not to say that they don't actually try to get people fired from their jobs, because we've seen it. They do go after people's employment. But not usually because of the person's skin color. And the chances of you being discriminated against, either in employment or through the government, by an anti-white social justice warrior is pretty fucking small. Pretty fucking small. And there are already laws against discrimination. So if you are being discriminated against by an anti-white social justice warrior or by a white supremacist, you can file a complaint, you can sue them, and you can have your day in court and fight them through the system. Now, I did mention that women and minorities have been historically oppressed groups. But that doesn't mean I really support identity politics. I understand why the groups were formed. And perhaps at the time, they were completely justified. But I think that today, in our modern society, where pretty much 99.99% of the population believes in equality, that if there is some sort of issue of discrimination or some sort of law that is unfair, I think that the best way to approach that is by talking about it rationally. Not be like, oh, well, I'm a black person, so X law or Y law is good or Y law is bad. No. Make a rational and a logical case for why you think the law is good or bad. Or if you think the law is discriminatory, then say something about it. And I think that most people be like, yeah, that sounds like a reasonable criticism. That sounds like a reasonable concern, and they'll work with you to fix the problem. But when you make it a black versus white issue, or you make it a male versus female issue, when you do that, all you're doing is pitting people against each other, and you're making it so that people who might agree with you, might be your allies, might fight on your side to oppose the specific law, the specific policy, or whatever it happens to be, are going to not want to associate with you. And so you're turning away actual allies and people who would help you fight discrimination because you're so extreme about it. So no, I can't get behind identity politics, even if it's not bigoted. I don't think that that's the way forward. I don't think that that's going to bring people together, and I don't think it's the best approach to solve issues. For instance, look at Black Lives Matter, for instance. They say that they're talking about police brutality. And I think that they don't really go about it the right way, and I think that some of the cases they choose to defend are very questionable, to say the least. But if they would have made it about police brutality, and they would have advocated for everybody who is a victim of police brutality, or advocating for reforming the police system in a certain way, then we could have that conversation. But when you're going to ignore white victims of police brutality and only focus on black victims, that's not helping our society. All you're doing is going to make people think that you're racist. All you're going to do is make people think that you only care about victims of a specific group. Shouldn't we instead come together as a society, get white people and black people and everybody else all on the same page and all fighting for what they think is right, rather than trying to divide people in different subcategories based on arbitrary characteristics? And the same could be said for identity politics on any number of other issues. You know, people talk about raising black people out of poverty. Well, how about giving people the opportunity, regardless of their skin color, the opportunity to succeed? Raise everybody out of poverty, or at least give them the opportunity to raise themselves out of poverty. Not just black people, not just white people, but everybody. You know, you shouldn't base laws on trying to help one specific group. You know, if one specific group is going to benefit from the policy more than another group, that's fine. That's fine. But the law should be neutral. And the advocacy for the law should be neutral. Anyway, I've gone for about 20 minutes, and I've pretty much said everything I want to say about this. Thank you for watching, and this is Netscape, signing off.